Okay, let's make a start. Thanks for joining, everyone. So just to introduce myself, I'm Nick Pisciavadia. I direct the Imperial Business Partners program here at Imperial. And for those of you that are less familiar with IBP, it's our membership program for businesses. You can have a look at imperial.ac.uk/IBP to find out more about the IBP membership that your organizations will be part of. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of our series of webinars. So the idea of these is to provide some insight into important, relevant areas for our member companies, and to look at the interface between science, technology, and business, and really explore some useful domains within that. And so we want to stimulate collaboration, and we would love to work with you on things that relate to the subject area being discussed. So before we jump in, some housekeeping. If you could ensure that your microphone's on mute while we go through the main webinar. And if you want to ask questions at any point, please use the chat function. There is a chat button. There should be a chat button at the bottom of your windows. So just click on that and ask a question. And you can also use that if you're having trouble with sound or video, and just mention that on the chat function and we'll try to help. So we aim to run for about an hour, and that includes some time for Q&A. The Q&A will be conducted under the Chatham House rule. So if you want to put in your questions in the chat function, you can do that in advance. In the Q&A towards the end of the hour, we'll open that up and you will take some of those questions that have been posted, but you can also unmute and just ask questions directly using your own voice. So with that, let me hand you over to Alyssa Gilbert, who's the head of policy and translation at Imperial's Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, to intro and moderate this discussion on sustainability and resource efficiency. Away you go, Alicia.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Nick, for the introduction. So I work here at Imperial at the Grantham Institute, where we cover issues to do with climate change and environmental issues. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mike Tennant and Dr. Arturo Castillo, both who work at Imperial Center for Environmental Policy, who have a wealth of expertise on the circular economy and resource efficiency. They're going to kick it off by giving us a short presentation into their areas of expertise, focusing on what the circular economy really means for business. And then we'll have a little bit of a conversation between the two of them, and then open it up for you to ask us some questions to make it really relevant to your business. So without further ado, it would be great to hear from Dr. Tennant and Dr. Castillo.
Hi, thanks, Alyssa. Thanks everybody for joining in. My name's Mike Tennant. I work in the Center for Environmental Policy here at Imperial. What I wanted to do was really to go through a few really basic slides on the circular economy concepts, just so we're all starting from the same place. And then we can do some more detailed questions later on, and then Arturo is going to do some work on the plastics side of that. So circular economy, just as a reminder for those of you who know what it is, and for a really quick introduction for those of you who don't. You'll have seen lots of pictures of the circular economy, but I find this is the best way or the most intuitive way to understand it is to start from the waste hierarchy. And you can see that there are a number of key operations that we usually consider when considering sustainability in terms of materials. From at the top, reduce being the most likely operation that will have the highest environmental impact, through to landfill, which you want to avoid if you possibly can. And so this has been around for a good number of years now. And the way to link it to the circular economy is just really to imagine that you can elaborate a number of these categories and come up with a lot of the key ideas behind the circular economy. So, for example, recycling, C in that hierarchy, can be elaborated in terms of different types of cycles, cycling within technical streams, so materials, steel, iron, and biological streams, so composting and biodegradation. And that's essentially the foundations of the circular economy. Over on the other side, so I've got a list of some of the key concepts behind that, and these two have mashed together. So we're looking at ideas of dematerialization, dematerializing, so actually trying to do at least the same, if not better, with fewer material and energy inputs, and you can see a number of those activities there, everything from lightweighting through to an absolute reduction in selling things. Some of these are easier than the others. I think a key idea to get forward is that circular economy is essentially about slowing the use of resources. I mean, it's difficult to stop the use of resources. I mean, you can imagine business models aren't necessarily set up for that type of thing. But we slow them through a number of operations, going from things like maintaining all the way through to remanufacturing. So that's a really quick overview. I want to just focus on the last particular part in one follow-up slide, this idea of waste is food. Circular economy is mainly being used to look at product redevelopment most recently. So everything from packaging through to automobiles. But one of the original ideas was that we never think of waste as waste because that's valueless and it gets chucked away. We think about it as food to go into other cycles. And here, two key examples, AB Sugar and Kalundborg, which is an industrial ecology estate in Denmark. So if you look at the Kalundborg example, that'll be on your right hand side, then you can see that what could be considered waste, so steam, yeast, fermentation sludge, is actually taken from one activity, one sector, one business, and fed into another as a primary input. You can contrast that with the AB Sugar example, where AB Sugar, they're the largest sugar beet producers in the UK, or sugar producers in the UK, and what they've done is to take what would normally be considered waste, and rather than just produce sugar, they produce a number of these products you see at the bottom, from high value chemicals, so bioethanol, betaine, through to Sainsbury's Taste the Difference tomatoes, and they clean stones and sell them back to garden centres, which I think is pretty cool. Those are two examples of non-product uses. I think that I'm going to stop there. I've got a couple of other slides that we'll probably bring in later, talking about the economics and the barriers. But bring you over to Arturo now, so we can talk about plastics.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Arturo Castillo, also based at the Center for Environmental Policy here at Imperial. And I work on resource efficiency and the circular economy, and I focus on plastics and metal. And within that, I try to focus on how to reduce and prevent the problem of plastic pollution. And hence, I'm giving you this overview on how to link ocean plastic pollution with the circular economy. So as many of you know, in the business world, defining a problem properly is actually sometimes taking you halfway towards solving it. And I can see nowadays that actually the world is still grappling with defining the problem. And as you can see, this is a very complex system What I have here on this slide is an example of how everything just starts getting more and more complex. At the beginning, you start with many different functions that we have. We use plastics nowadays to provide different functions and services. But then we have many different products for each one of those functions. And you can see how that complexity starts ramifying even more and more, each one of these stages. And when you start thinking about global supply chains and all those products and functions across the world, you realize that we're dealing with thousands of different products on the market. Now, if that were not complicated enough, we need to remember that sometimes, quite often, in most cases actually, the formulation of those products is not always known because you don't know what chemicals have been included in the fabrication at each stage of the manufacturing and the value chain. So that becomes difficult when we try to figure out what's the impact on the environment, animal life and humans. And also it becomes difficult when you try to figure out how you could recover it. And because you still don't know what chemicals are in it and what quality and properties you could have. So another part of the problem is this one. So the reality that we have landed ourselves with is that we have created effectively two worlds. What you can see here on the left-hand side is one world that actually has as objective to sell a product. On the right-hand side, you have another world, and its objective is to solve a problem. And this is difficult because they have different stakeholders, different objectives, and it's just and also different information. And the way we start losing material nowadays is that you start from material extraction out here all the way through to retail. Then there comes this use phase of the product, which can be between seconds and years. And then when the product becomes discarded or unwanted, then a completely different world starts. And you have different ways of dealing with it. And actually, you could argue that on the left-hand side, you're dealing with commercial questions, and on the right-hand side, you're dealing predominantly with a public service. There's a business element to it, but it's predominantly a public service of containing waste. And the other difficulty here is that I've only written here recycling, but in reality, at the end of this, you have other things like final disposal to landfill or treatment for energy recovery or just mass reduction. And as you can see, and you can imagine immediately, recycling is a little bit more costly than those. So the situation today is that we're really struggling to recover some material from this world, and actually it's only a fraction that makes it back, and it's sold back to this other world again. And that's very difficult, and it adds to the complication of how to really achieve a circular economy. Now, we often get asked, what's the solution? And as I was just saying in the previous slide, there are many different points at which you can come in with an intervention. Sometimes people say, how about innovation X, Y, or Z? But when you look at it carefully, it turns out that they only solve a little part of the problem. And what we need to do is to think of it as a system that actually has a zero-sum game. And we need to be careful that we don't think that we are switching off one part of the problem by switching on another problem in another part of the system. So if we run through one example, you could have here the current use of plastic, and you could do a number of things. You could continue to do that same use. And for that, once the product is discarded, you would need a certain kind of treatment and reprocessing, and hopefully you will be bringing that material back. Now, as it is, we're struggling a lot to recover material under the current paradigm. Now, let's see what happens if you come up with a substitution or a different innovation. Sometimes the innovation side just looked at in isolation, but what we need to consider is that what will happen after that product gets discarded. What happens is that you will need, by definition, a new treatment that is different from the previous one. And that means new infrastructure, and that means new investment. And in many places, you cannot have resources to actually do this new one when you haven't sorted yourself out with this one. Now, the other thing that can happen is that you really try to reduce demand. And that's very difficult because you can decide not to eat produce from a different part of the world. But even if you did that, there will always be, sometimes inadvertently, you will go to some substitution because you will be consuming something else, or you will actually revert to consuming some of the previous thing before. So that means that even if you reduce a little bit of demand, that doesn't mean that there will be zero treatment. There always is something else happening. So I just have a picture here of a complex system to remind us that just devising something at this end is not enough. We need to think about what's going to happen at the other end. Otherwise, we're still very far from the circular economy. Now, finally, we have the question, where do we go from here? So if you start with current plastics, you could say, right, should we recycle, reuse, or do any one of those things that I have around that circle over there? And I just, as I was just saying before, the idea is not to say that there is always one of those technologies that is good or bad. Everything is highly context dependent, and probably the takeaway message is that you cannot say just because technology A was successful in context A, I cannot assume that it will be successful in context B, because you have other infrastructure and even cultural and socioeconomic dependencies there. So what I believe is more useful is to ask some questions to see that can help us in this journey, to see how do we continue to provide all those things like food preservation, shelter, and all the different uses of plastic for an increasing population, and still trying or striving to achieve a little bit more of the circular economy. So those three questions would be, how might we further link material to sustain value? How might we coordinate supply chains? And how might we increase material recovery? And with that, I just say thank you, and I'm looking forward to some interesting discussion and to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you both for introducing us really nicely into the topic. Lots of food for thought there. So I wanted to start by picking up on something which you both alluded to when you talked about the circular economy. Mike, you described the circular economy as a slowing of use of some kind. And I think you also spoke there when you showed us the diagram of options, Arturo, about reducing the use of a material as one of the options when you're managing treatment. But of course, a lot of businesses like to sell us things. So how do you see that working, building a circular economy in a business-driven world?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Some feedback here. Yeah, I think that's there we go. That's better. I think that's one of the biggest challenges is if you actually look back at that waste hierarchy, then nominally reduction has the greatest environmental impact, but it is also the most difficult to sell to people and to sell to business. The common way to think about it in the circular economy is to look at an idea called product service systems. So one takes a product and replaces it by a service. So Interface are a carpet manufacturer. They're probably one of the key sustainability businesses in the world at the moment, and they think about carpets not as a physical product, but as a function that the carpet actually provides, so warmth, comfort, soundproofing, which allows them to do all sorts of things and sell those particular services. Rolls-Royce, for example, they sell aeroplane engines, and they sell the performance of the, they lease engines and they sell the performance. So what they have to do is ensure that all the big airplane manufacturers can get the same performance every time out of the engines that they lease from Rolls-Royce, which means that they have to put in place different back-end packages, which involves CapEx. So it does become a tricky question, a tricky question for businesses to actually do. How do you actually do this?
Yeah, those are some really nice tangible examples there, though, I think, about how few organizations have managed it. Arturo, did you want to say something to that?
Well, I just wanted to link it back to the idea that in addition to coming up with a new product or a new business idea or a product service system, there is the element of the socio-technical participation. So we see, particularly with plastic, that people are interested in doing the right thing. So, and the number of people who are aware of the problem is increasing. I don't know whether it is fast enough, but it's increasing. So then I think linking those two and say, you know, which is there a job to doing some messaging that says, you know, people, you're not interested in having 3 kilos of material in your kitchen. You're interested in having the ability to make coffee, or you're interested in having the ability to make photocopies, or you know, there are any number of things. And by just reinforcing that messaging, you can bring more and more of the business customers to actually become comfortable and even demand the product service systems that Mike was talking about. So it's a toing and froing between the business world and also engaging with consumers. And I think the plastic pollution is a way that actually allows you to bring to life that connection.
So maybe if I just thank you that, because okay, so I think it opens up another issue, is customer acceptance. So we know that the further away you get from a product towards some sort of service, the more difficult it is for customers to accept. You imagine, so a great example is Whirlpool. Whirlpool, the washing machine manufacturers, back in the 70s, they started leasing washing machines. Nobody wanted them because it was the end of the hire purchase era, and everybody wanted to own stuff. And that's pretty much the same now. Ownership, personal ownership of stuff in a mass consumption society makes it very difficult to move away from just a product to a service. So it's behaviorally tricky. And involves capex to redesign your products.
And you know, there's so many things, and even with the best solutions and with the best intentions, invariably within the general public, it will take time and a couple of steps to actually go from the current model and the way of owning stuff to actually transitioning to another model of actually acquiring the ability to do something.
Yeah, so let's just explore that a little bit further about where you think consumers are now in this story. Arturo, you referred to the fact that we've seen an increase in public concern about plastic waste, for example, and perhaps some small behavior changes like not drinking plastic straws or whatever. But Mike, you also implied that we're in not too dissimilar a place to where we were maybe some decades ago, where people still like to own things. On the other hand, I do think we see sort of emerging technology. People like to use these new apps, things like Uber and so on, and people offer things like laundry services and so on. Do you see a sort of a gradual change in process of consumer behavior that's significant enough to help with the circular economy?
Well, as I was saying before, it is going to be a multi-stage journey. And with the complexity, at least from the plastic perspective, which is what I'm used to thinking about, is there are so many different product types that they will actually have different journeys. And I believe that, yes, in some cases, some of them have a chance to be more or a little bit smoother than others. I think people are realizing that we're well on track to be 9 billion people in the future by 2050 and so on. So I think you can see some demographic changes, like the average size of a family is getting smaller, and also people are living in smaller places, sharing more things. And if you see even the change between one generation and the other, you see that more people now are very familiar with doing things, as you were saying, with the mobile phone and the sharing economy and things like that. And so it's probably going to be, for many product groups, a generational change, and for others it might take longer, and for others it might be surprisingly quickly. But it depends. It would take a long time to actually analyze product type. But probably the one sentence answer is it will take time. It is a journey, and in most of the product groups, I think we're at the very beginning. So there's a very significant job to be done to actually take people to the journey.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right, Simon. So you can pull out examples of things like Spotify, which are pretty simple. But when you look at Uber, for example, there's so congestion in San Francisco has increased by 40% over normal population growth. because of lift sharing, just because of the vast number of cars actually running around San Francisco. So, trying to understand unintended consequences of what should normally be a really good idea, a really good technology, is incredibly important.
Of course. No, I just think that this, the question of where people are is just fascinating, because it can be so many different things that you need to do still to go on that journey. And I suppose for some parts of the population and for some activities, I would be hopeful that that people will pick up on ways to use less resources and still have the same utility.
So just to continue, that's all really interesting reflections on the consumer. And so maybe we mentioned obviously that business models and the need to reduce isn't a natural fit easily with circular economy. Are there other particular challenges or barriers that you might want to highlight to achieving a circular economy model?
So I think for me, maybe I'll just flick back to a slide we actually have here. So this is some work that I did with a PhD student and a couple of PhD students a while back, and you can see the green column on the left is the circular economy operations that people could use, and if we look at how we can redesign products for those particular operations, then we have to consider a number of different things. So, for example, something really trivial, like which seem to be trivial, like reducing the use of something. Let's say we're reducing the use of a drill. Then we've got to, or we're reducing the number of drills are actually sold, so we can actually just sell the service. Then we've got to make sure that all of our drills are upgraded so that they're more durable, so that they can survive the logistics. We've got to look at logistics. We have volume sales going down, so implications for business models. We have CapEx increasing as we have to redesign. And of course, we have people not wanting to actually rent drills in the first place, because you can buy one for 30 quid down in Homebase. I think there are issues, but I think one of the major issues is there aren't enough examples. A lot of the examples in the circular economy are really quite simple things. So chair redesigns, for example, packaging from mushroom fibers, really complex contemporary products. There aren't enough examples to actually say what the real problems actually are. So we do need more people interpreting the circular economy and just doing it, so we can actually find out what the problems are.
Okay, great. That makes sense. That often you need to pilot something, don't you, to start understanding how to take it into a get more implementation in place, right? So we've had a question actually from someone on the webinar that I'm going to slip in now. So what do you think the role of regulation might be as a driver towards a circular economy? And when thinking of regulation, are there any specific regulations, perhaps even market creating kind of regulations, or some that use market forces, that you think might help move the circular economy in the right direction?
So I can talk generally to that, and then maybe you can talk specifically. We know from view of regulation. Regulation is absolutely essential to do this. I mean, most of the things that we're trying to fix in the circular economy would be considered to be market failures, and so we need regulation. Prime case is that of vehicles. So end-of-life vehicles directive and the waste directives from the EU have been absolutely essential in driving the amount of vehicles that are able to be recycled. And now, as of this year, I think it has to be 95% of a vehicle has to be recyclable in practice. The EU 2 years ago came up with the Circular Economy Directive, which was a proposal. And if that actually gets transcribed into practice, I think that's going to be absolutely crucial in driving this type of thing forward.
Okay, so in terms of plastics, I think there are similarities with other products and other materials. What you will need is a policy mix. And you will need to direct policy towards both ends of the supply chain, and actually the two worlds that I was talking about before, because it would be of little use to say, you know, I'm going to ban something if you don't have all the incentives on the other side to actually create the take back of those materials. So if you could ban whatever, you name it, whether it is bottles or whether it is bags. But if there's no incentives to make the business work, to actually take the material back, burning and burying material is still going to be cheaper, or open burning, or leaking into the environment. So you will need a mix of those, and actually it's absolutely essential. And also, not only do you need to target different parts of the supply chain, you also need to target different kinds of policies. Some of them are more coercive. Some of them are more incentivizing. So, for example, simple things that you can apply at the point of sale, like, for example, discounts. I think before the plastic bag charge, we used to have a discount. So if you actually used your own bag, or in some places when you use your own coffee cup or whatever, you actually get a discount. But in some places it works, in some places it doesn't. You need to see, again, going back to the context point. If you have a small country with a high income, high education population, you might be able to have successful incentive programs that might not work in a very different setting, or a very populous country with very low income. So you need to look at that, the point of sale. You need to look at why there are so many reasons why recycling is not successful today, and one of them is because it's so random. You know, the material that you get, what I was saying on my first slide, we don't know the formulations. So if we were to make things less toxic and less random, that would stand us in good stead to actually recycle a bit more. But you need all of those. If you do one in isolation, it's likely to fail.
I think a good example of that is creation of secondary markets. So the National Industrial Symbiosis Programme has been set up, or was set up, to try to create secondary markets for what would be considered waste, and that allows you to trade your waste products, which could of course be plastics, with companies who need that as their primary feedstock. I think the point is that you need policy to drive the market failure, and you also need market creation to capture some of these things, to turn them from waste into value.
Yeah, sometimes you will need a pool. So many people think or mention things like public procurement, because sometimes everything is in place, but you still have to kickstart the demand. Otherwise, you don't get economies of scale in the take-back process. So there are, but again, it's just one more pieces in the juggernaut that needs to actually work to bring us to a better place in the circular economy.
Yeah, great. No, I can see how it's about a whole collection of complementary policies, which is very, very broad, actually, and can touch upon many different policy areas. There were a couple that I wanted to pick up on because I think they're quite interesting. You could speak to either of them, I guess. One of them is, you mentioned early in your answer there, something about product design. And I'm curious to hear from you examples where you think product design is important. You mentioned it in relation to cars, obviously, but there are design for disposal is something that people talk about. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that. And then on the incentives that come down to sort of money rewards or charges, like the plastic bag charge, the examples you gave us so far were really things that affect a really end consumer, an individual buying their coffee, or a person at the supermarket checkout. Has there been experimentation yet with that kind of incentivization at the level of the companies and businesses? Some of those examples you showed us of the circular economy in operation at a business-wide level.
Yeah, there have been some examples, and there are some policies that you can target to the business world. For example, one is establishing minimum percentages of recycled content, because there is, not only do you have to probably stipulate that materials and products should be more recyclable in the first place, but also you need to say, you need to use those recyclable materials, because if they get lost, then this is completely pointless. So then the other policy that says products on the market will have to have a minimum percentage of recycled content, then that will really kick off the demand and the economies of scale for those reprocessing businesses to actually take off. And I think that applies to many product groups using plastic. And I don't know, is that what you were referring to? Is that your question? You have.
Yeah, no, that's great. That was a good example. And I wanted to hear maybe something about design as well, the role of design. And
yes, that's important. So design, you can have things like design for recyclability, or design for degradability, or design for whatever you want at the post-consumer stage. But again, it is good, and actually it's very important to do that. That should actually be as a matter of course. And it is with the greatest urgency to do that. But then it's also with the greatest urgency to actually say, how do you follow that up with developing and incentivizing the infrastructure to take out the material? Because if you were to end up with a lot of recyclable material, but nobody to pick it up, or with nobody that can actually deal with impurities that it brings with it, that would be substituting the plastic problem with another problem. Or for one of the typical examples is design for degradability. In most cases, we're talking about compostable materials that are designed to degrade in an industrial composting facility that has very particular conditions for the process to work that are very different to what you would find on the open environment, on a river, or in the ocean. So unless you make sure that the product is sold in the right context and that there's going to be the infrastructure to deal with it, unintentionally you might be contributing to one more of the problems.
And I think a great example of that is Innocent. So Innocent, the smoothie drinks maker, they introduced biodegradable plastics in their bottles. A good number of years ago, they put a cornstarch linker into their plastics, so it basically should have just fallen apart in industrial facilities, but of course it didn't. It wouldn't even go through the council's recycling systems, because they haven't designed that far ahead. They thought about the problem, designed something that ostensibly dealt with fossil plastic bottles not degrading, but hadn't thought about how you actually go about that degradation in the first place. So design, and of course our Dyson School for Design Engineering here at Imperial does a lot of thinking around product redesign for things like sustainability and the circular economy.
okay, great. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear the things that could go wrong with design as well as it being desirable. And that goes back to what you were saying earlier, Mike, about how we need to start doing these things. It's not until you try it out, then you test it out and you think, okay, well, we're not ready for that step just yet. Now, I think it would be a good moment now just to invite the people who are on the call. Please feel free to ask some questions. You can just press that button where it says to raise your hand, and I'll be looking out for that if you have any questions. And while you're gathering your thoughts and thinking about questions, I'm going to send another one the way of Mike and Arturo. So you said something interesting in your talk there, Arturo, about how context dependent decisions are about how you manage waste. And I wonder if, how can we really scale up things like the circular economy if we look at each specific example in such a deeply context relevant way? How can we start making something that's a bit more like a general rule?
General rule. I think that if we had a general rule or a short answer, we probably wouldn't be here. The challenge of the context dependency is a really serious one, because at the beginning, what you want to do when you're designing a product is for it to be applicable in as many places as possible. And that is in direct contradiction to what do you do in a different context where people might be able to do different things in the post-consumer stage. So I don't think there's a short answer to that. Probably what you would need to do is to do different market segmentation to what we have now. And at least if you're not going to divide products by country by country, because that's just not feasible. But you might actually think about, why don't we think about, first of all, dematerializing, as we were saying, is that possible? How do we increase recovery, make it easier? And if you cannot do those, then you might at least say, well, these products sell better in particular climates of the world. That would be a way to start. If you're going to be selling products in a tropical weather, then you might want to redesign a little bit some of the elements of the packaging and of the product itself. And if you're going to be in temperate weathers and so on, climates, then you might have different configurations. And if we're moving really to a circular economy, is rather than having that those two different worlds that I showed at the beginning, what can you do to actually make those talk more? And it may be that you might have a business model that connects some parts of the model that I had on the left to the one that I had on the right, so that you can actually start to ask questions like, what would happen if people on the right, which is, I'm going to show it again. So what would happen if people on this side of the screen could actually have an idea of what's coming on this end, if there was less randomness? And what if, using the richness of data that we have nowadays, what would happen if they know what's coming and when it's coming? And what would happen if they were not entirely different people to these ones? So, and actually, when we talk about the circular economy, if you think about one of the first slides by Mike, when you had different arrows of different sizes, and actually the smaller arrows actually also represent a smaller circle of the circular economy. Because rather than waiting for the material to come up here and make it all the way back to the other system, what about just keeping it in this area here? Or how about from here to here? And that's when, there's not, I don't think there's a quick rule. That will depend. There's a business model for doing that transition, the one from here to there. There's another business model to keeping this in smaller circles. So yeah, I'm afraid there's no short answer and there's no general rule. In fact, I would argue that that's one of my main takeaway messages, that we need to be, ironically, if you want to move closer to the circular economy, you need to be more mindful of your context.
Yeah. So there may be a question on a similar vein to you, Mike, then. Arturo, you've spoken about it being very context relevant. And then, Mike, you showed us this really nice example of AB Sugar and then the other plant in operation. And they very, very integrated. They were very integrated and thoughtfully done to make sure that, as you said, the waste is food, right? Now, I wonder how can we do that in a sort of dynamic way over time? How would a site like that be able to change over time, maybe introduce new people onto an industrial site and so on? How might that work? Or is that really just something you can only do as a one-off snapshot, one company, one place, one time?
So maybe I can link that to the question that's come in. There's a question saying, what approach should a company take when starting to think about developing a circular strategy? What's the starting point? And I think that's very relevant. I think that the starting point has to be, well, I suppose it can be a number of things. I think you have to do some sort of audit where you actually try to understand what your high impact processes or products actually are. So that would be one way to start. And then say, okay, so what is the potential for circularity there? And as Arturo said, circularity can be taken in a number of different ways, and there are many routes to linking up all of these cycles. So one of my PhD students, Fenna Blomsma, did a lot of work on this and trying to link how companies make sense of the circular economy and and then try to implement that, and they go all over the place. So start with an audit either on high impact or on what value you think you could get out of the waste products you actually have. So yeah, you can take a general rule of thumb and say, well, yeah, waste is costing me money. So yeah, even the most trivial thing, going back to AB sugar in this case, we take the sugar beets, we take out the innards and turn it into sugar, and then we've got a load of biomass that's actually left. So we chuck it away. So what could we actually do with that? And that's the creative part. The audit of high impact is relatively straightforward. You know, you do a life cycle analysis, you get a consultant in. I think you've got to be a lot more creative with looking at what you can do with low value waste streams. And that's the fun bit, I think. So yeah, so those would be, hopefully that's a reasonable answer to Eleanor's question, and also to yours as well, Alyssa.
Great. And Arturo, do you have any tips then for business? What are the first steps they could take towards a circular economy that might be different or additional to what Mike said?
I think rather than additional, is reinforcing what Mike just said. It's very important to go back to very, very basic principles and say, what is it that I'm trying to do? What is my business? What problem is my business solving? And again, you might be that you may or may not be in one of those product areas that might be susceptible for realizing that you didn't want stuff, that you wanted the ability to do something. So that's one of the main questions. And I'm just trying to see also, as I was saying before in that slide, do I have any possibilities of linking up with the nowadays detached world? Can we do something together and see, can we keep this material flow more reversible? And then that will depend on what is your business, how the value that actually is embedded in the material, or it's merely just a vehicle for providing a service. And once you understand that, then you can carry on. And as Mike said, do your audit of what is it that you do, and all of those things.
Okay, good. I think there's some good tips and starting points for people there.
Can I just add a little bit to that? Because I think you mentioned this a couple of times, but I think it's well worth reinforcing that. It's important to actually consider unintended consequences. Oh. So yeah, we had the innocent example of it bunging up recycling streams. We've got the Uber example of it bunging up San Francisco, and even simple things. So Patagonia had a great example where, so Patagonia, absolute leader in sustainability thinking and practice, they wanted to reduce the number of products that their customers were buying. Wealthy people, buy stuff, expensive stuff. So they had an advertising campaign that said, "Don't buy this jacket," and sales rocketed. They were. It was apparently one of their best marketing strategies. So thinking about that is sort of amusing.
Okay, great. Yeah. So again, more kind of experimentation to get it right. It sounds like to me.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then, maybe touching upon that, about this idea that there could be unintended consequences. And going back to what you were talking about, Arturo, around plastics, that there was a surge in the UK in consciousness about plastic waste, which has led to a plethora of replacements, right? Now you can't get a plastic bag, but you'll be given a paper bag. You might be given a paper straw instead of a plastic straw. And of course, those are producing paper and card is very high energy intensity. And of course, these substitutions aren't so straightforward. So, I know in part this goes back to what you're saying about things being context relevant, but how can we work hard at the beginning of these decisions to manage and perhaps reduce the number of perverse impacts that we see?
I couldn't hear very well your last three words. Now, how can we
manage things like substitutions better so that we kind of avoid these perverse incentives maybe from the outset? And maybe I'll add something else in now. How do we communicate that well to people? If you've got public interest, how can we communicate that? People want to do the right thing. How can we help that?
Well, the thing is that is the responsibility of both sides. It's not There can be unintended consequences of the behavior of people when using and disposing of a product, and there can be unintended consequences of somebody bringing a product into the market. So what messages do we give to both of those sides? So, basically try to analyze. I would go at least one step upstream and one step downstream of whichever product or business you're in, and say, so what happens if I now use paper? We know that, for example, if you were to recycle paper, which I hope that people would be intending to do, you need to remember that every time you recycle paper, the fibers get smaller, shorter. So you always need to have additional virgin fiber. Where is that going to come from? So always think about, if I'm going to substitute, I don't know, a third of the world's plastic with material X, where is that substitution going to come from? And at least one, let alone more steps, but at least one step in your supply chain, is there going to be something? And just as a matter of due diligence. And for the consumers as well, if you say, well, I'm going to switch from a plastic bag to a paper bag, or from a plastic cup to a metal cup, then what does that mean? And I think it's only starting. The messaging. Your question was about the messaging. What do we tell people? You get, again, mixed messages. Some I think there was an article that says that you need to use a cotton bag something like I don't know, a couple thousand number of times before it actually makes. But there are many points to that messaging. One of them is that you need to consider that if you use that bag, even if it's only a couple hundred times, you have the potential of stopping different kinds of damage that the plastic bag would have done, because it's not just, it can be chemical, it can be physical, the damage. So if you replace 100 bags, although maybe in emissions terms might not be still significant, in physical terms it might be significant. So that's point number one. And point number two is that on the example of the cotton bag, when you do the numbers, if you use your cotton bag once every other day, by the time you've used it for, I don't know, a year, you've already used it a couple hundreds of times. And I did the numbers the other day. One of the bags I've used for 6 years. So it's just, but the messaging is only starting, and there's still confusion. There is hype. There are counter messages as well. So it's inevitable that I think we'll see a little bit more confusion before there is clarity. But just, it's a very simple recommendation. Think about what happens to your product after you've used it, whether it is the original plastic one or the substitution. Very simple.
And I think plastic bags, obviously a great example of where regulation has been absolutely essential to drive the number of plastic bags, or at least single-use plastic bags down.
Definitely.
So,
Definitely.
Yeah, that wouldn't have happened without regulation, I don't think.
Okay, so we're nearly coming to a close now, but there's been one more question from Jed. So I wonder if we can just take that very quickly, and then I'll hand back over to Nick. So the question here is asking you, really, are there resources or organizations available that can help businesses identify and cooperate with other businesses to build these partnerships that are necessary for the circular economy?
Yeah, I think that probably, going back to the National Institute for National Industrial Symbiosis Program, they were government funded first, but now they're private. So they're certainly one organization to seek out in developing secondary markets. But also the Ellen MacArthur Foundation runs something called the C100. So it's businesses and regions, so Scotland, Wales, various European countries, or mainland Europe, we're still there, coming together to share best practice. And so those would be probably, the C100, I think, would be one of the most useful ones.
Okay, great. Well, thanks Arturo and Mike for all of your great input. I'm going to just hand over to Nick now to close off.
Great, yeah, so thank you all, actually, Alyssa, Arturo, Mike, for a really stimulating and engaging discussion. I certainly learned a few things there, and I hope our IBP members that have joined have found it stimulating and thought-provoking, and I've found the time well spent. So we want to create more engagement through these webinars. And so if you have follow-on questions, please email us through ibp@imperial.ac.uk. And as members, you have a Pathfinder service through Imperial Business Partners. That means that we can do short turnaround projects. So if there are things around this domain you want to use your Pathfinder for, please let us know, and we'll help mobilize that. And we can also help with navigation around Imperial. I also want to just signpost a couple of things. One is the Grantham Institute's website, which gives a great overview of the kind of research we do around environment and climate change. So that's imperial.ac.uk/Grantham. And you can also, if you want to learn a bit more about Imperial Business Partners, you can go to imperial.ac.uk/IBP. And as members, you as individuals in the companies that are members, you can join our IBP LinkedIn group. So if you're on LinkedIn, please just go to your LinkedIn homepage, go to groups and search Imperial Business Partners, and please make a request to join the group and you'll see updates. We're going to post a video of this webinar there, so it will have a life after this that you can refer to and share with colleagues. And we'd love to hear what more topics you'd like to explore through webinars. This is a series and it's for our members. So please let us know if there are other things, burning issues that you think Imperial can help with. We'd love to help you out. So with that, I'm going to close this first webinar. Thanks again to Alyssa, to Arturo and Mike. Thank you all for joining, and have a good rest of your days. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.